Hi, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm with the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and with me today is my good friend David Gartenstein-Ross. David is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, also the founder and CEO of Valens Global, a firm working in the national security space. David, how are you today?
Doing great, Matt. It's great to be on here talking with you.
Yeah, it's been a while since we did one of these. I'm really glad we could do it. So, yes, we are here to talk about American foreign policy under the presidency of Donald J. Trump, is a thing that I just said. Um, so, we've seen a few appointments. We've got the National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn. We've got the Deputy National Security Advisor, K.T. McFarlane, a former Reagan administration official and longtime Fox News personality, among other things. What's your take on what we've seen in terms of appointments and what direction they indicate for the foreign policy of Trump?
It's an interesting set of appointments. I mean, I'd also point to Mike Pompeo as head of CIA, which I think is
Right.
an excellent pick. I mean, he's someone who I have the utmost respect for. You have a mix of ideologies and a mix of personalities coming in, but all of them I think could be regarded quite rightly as outsiders under the Obama administration. I think outsiders for some time before that. It's a break. I think it is actually a break from what you describe as foreign policy establishment views. They're not a radical break. Just as with Obama, he represented certainly a break from the Bush administration tradition, and was someone who came with substantially less experience coming in as commander in chief. So this is a time when we've hit a point of inflection. I don't think that we'll ever see a return fully to the Obama foreign policy paradigm, to the Bush foreign policy paradigm. But at the same time, it's not going to be this radical break in the sense that you both have path dependencies and you also have people who have a lot of experience within government that's going to keep this looking more like a familiar American foreign policy, though one that has key differences.
So, what are those key differences? I mean, let's back up first. So, you
Yeah.
say we will unlikely see a return to the Obama foreign policy or the Bush foreign policy. Now, I perceive those as two fairly different foreign policies. Do you?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So the issues that I work, obviously, is largely on counterterrorism or violent non-state actor issues. And Mark Lynch wrote a number of years ago, back in 2011, that there was much more continuity than difference from the last 2 years of Bush to the
Yeah.
first 2 years of Obama. I think that was correct.
Hmm.
I think once you
Hmm.
hit the Arab uprisings, there was significant diversion.
Yeah.
But Bush foreign policies has generally been characterized. I think this is accurate through about 2006 as a neoconservative foreign policy. For Obama, it was a foreign policy where there'll be, I think, in part some continuity. Obama wanted to avoid getting involved in another major war in the Middle East. A lot of his foreign policy was a foreign policy that seems geared towards withdrawal, with the way things were shaped, kind of indicating the pace of withdrawal, and not obviously not full withdrawal, but a step back from this active U.S. involvement that we'd seen under Bush. We'll
Hmm.
see part of
Right.
that within the Trump presidency. But the big issue, and a piece that I know you like a lot from Thomas Wright, reflects this. One of the big issues is this a return to an isolationist or mercantilist type foreign policy where the U.S. plays a much diminished role and rejects the
Hmm.
liberal order that it had helped to build? And that's an interesting question. I don't think we know
Yeah.
the answer, but I think that for the first time in a long time, you actually have these philosophies of foreign policy that are on the table and that are
Hmm.
going to be debated in real ways.
Right. Well, I think your point about Obama and some of the similarities with Trump, I mean, I think that's valid. I mean, I think there are some, what I would call them surface similarities,
Yeah.
right? Obama clearly wanted to kind of draw down or redefine or define in a much more limited way what America's actual interests are in the Middle East, for example. But he also wanted to refocus attention toward areas which he thought were much more important for the future, such as Asia. Um, though I think there's a huge difference, and I think some on the right who are opposed to Obama and also opposed to Trump, neoconservatives in particular, tried to play up these similarities. But I think there's just a huge difference in that, even though Obama wanted to de-emphasize certain areas and, emphasize, and overemphasize or emphasize more other areas like Asia, there was still a very, very strong belief that America benefits from its investment in the international order. Right?
I agree with that. I don't think that there's much more than those surface similarities. And in fact, even those surface similarities are actually very different. If you look at the big area where Trump said he will engage more, it's the fight against jihadism. So the region that Obama wanted most to get out of is the one where Trump promises to re-engage. So yeah, I wasn't meaning to suggest that those similarities were more than what they are. With Obama, not only did you not get a skepticism of the liberal international order, you had both a firm belief in it and the notion, as Obama said multiple times in his reference to the arc of history, that the arc of history bends in the direction of the values that he favors. I think that some authors have said correctly, and this is, for example, an observation that Henry Kissinger made in his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, that to that extent, part of Obama's passivity in certain areas was a belief that his values inevitably would win out. And so, to some extent, he could take his hands off the wheel and let history run its course. Yes, they're very different in terms of foreign policy.
Mm. So, I think one thing, and yeah, I'm glad you referenced that Tom Wright piece, because I do think, and I know it, I was just rereading it earlier this morning, and it was published on January 20th of this year. So it'll be a year old when Donald Trump takes the oath of office. And I think one thing that comes through in that piece that I think has been just validated repeatedly is something that is true of kind of Donald Trump's pitch in general across a whole range of issues, is this idea that, America's not winning enough, we're not as strong as we used to be, and all these other people are getting over on us. They're taking advantage of us. They're taking advantage of you, whether it's people here, illegal immigrants, others, other countries taking American jobs, countries just kind of free riding, whether it's NATO or other partners who need to start paying their fair share and fessing up, and America's going to go in and I'm going to get out there and get what's yours, right?
Yep. That's inherently at the center of the Trump foreign policy. I think when he first articulated this, the first time that I saw this, framed so starkly, was in his convention speech. Not that he hadn't alluded to that before, but that was the first time, at least, that I saw the reference to globalism versus nationalism, which I think people thought of as a rather quixotic campaign theme at the time. But it's a very real theme. Perhaps, and if you look at the two foreign policies, and even I'd say the Bush foreign policy and also the Clinton foreign policy before it, you had this strong globalist dimension, meaning that things that weren't necessarily in the U.S. national interest in and of themselves were seen as good when there's some sort of broader benefit to the liberal order. So for Clinton, the intervention in Kosovo in 1999, saving lives in that area was thought of as being a good, even though it didn't directly affect American interests. And you can see that even in both the Libya war under Obama and the lead up to the Iraq war, where a lot of the Iraq war's justification came down to WMDs. But if you strip out that justification, one thing I've said a lot is that the Iraq war looks a lot like the Libya war. Both of them, inherently, there was discussion of overthrowing a dictator who was brutalizing his own people and bringing democracy to an area of the world that badly needed some, and the ripple effects that it would have. It's remarkable for Obama, who was the anti-Iraq war president, to then have a very similar justification, with WMD stripped out. So to me, all of that reflects globalism to some extent, and Trump promises something different.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you on the globalism versus nationalism, or another way to put it, as Peter Beinart put it, in noting some of the similarities between, Netanyahu's vision and Trump's vision and some of these other European right-wing parties is, particularism versus universalism in terms of rights and conceptions of value. But I mean, just going back to Libya, just to stick on this for a minute, Libya, as I remember it, it would basically came down to, yes, there were people inside the administration, Clinton being one of them, who were pushing for an intervention. But what eventually tipped it toward, Obama saying yes, was that he was convinced that Gaddafi was going to carry out a massacre in Benghazi.
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah.
I guess we can say yes. I mean, it is ironic that Obama, and we showed very quickly that we were not going to kind of go in there and carry the burden and carry the water for everyone as we had been expected to do in times before, and that, we can say that's one of the reasons why Libya turned out as it did. But, I mean, this was I think the threat was much more immediate.
Well, yeah, so I'd add two other things, though. One of them, it wasn't just that Gaddafi was going to carry out a massacre. There was, secondly, you had the Arab League put together a proposal that was much more robust than people had expected. Right. But then there's a third one which I've alluded to, and let me be upfront that this is unproven. And I really, at some point, am looking forward to when there's a broader historical record. But to me, it seems like democracy promotion was very explicitly a part of it. So there's this thing that Obama said. He said, he said, finally, our interests and our values are aligned. And, when it comes to the question of what interest was he referring to, the only thing I could think of, and again, to reference Mark Lynch, who was a proponent of the Libya intervention, had at the time talked about how he saw the Arab uprisings as being stalled. And he saw intervention in Libya as a way to unstall the Arab uprisings. I hope that's an accurate description of what he's written, though I'm certain we'll find it right after we're done here. And he was very influential in the administration at that point in time, someone who had access to NSC and other places. And he wasn't the only one who was saying this. It's just Lynch was the one who I honed in on at the time as making that argument. That's, to me, seems to be part of what had driven Obama's thinking, and that at the time, if you look at what people were saying in the field of CT analysis, there was this overwhelming consensus, and one which, for the record, I disagreed with, but there was this overwhelming consensus that the Arab uprisings and the sweeping away of old regimes was just devastating to jihadist groups. The New York Times had a piece about how al-Qaeda was watching history fly by. And so to me, when he talks about interests and values aligning, that actually seems to be what he's talking about. And so if I'm correct in that reading of tea leaves, then that looks a lot like the Iraq War. Though you're correct that the Benghazi slaughter, which he did intervene to prevent, is something that was more immediate and limited term. Though, of course, very quickly, it went from a defensive no-fly zone to a broader mission, which results in regime change.
Right. And the resulting complete state collapse, which created opportunities for the groups that you're talking about, right?
Yep. And similar to Iraq, was a disaster.
Yeah, exactly.
And so all of which points to and look, I mean, at the end of the day, I didn't support Trump on the campaign trail. I know you didn't either. But one thing that I firmly believe is that it does open this space for discussion in a way that's needed. I mean, and there's a few different areas, but when you look at the particularism versus universalism, that's an interesting way to frame it. I'm not sure that I agree with that framing. I think that it's perhaps. I also don't love the globalism versus nationalism framing. Maybe I'll be able to, before the end of this discussion, think of a better way to frame it. I think that national interests have often in foreign policy taken too much of a back seat, that a lot of our mistakes have ended up being made when we get away from a national interest calculation. That being said, I also think that we've had a lot of interests in the liberal order. There's a lot of ways in which that benefits the U.S. as well as many people beyond the United States. And then, secondly, for foreign policy, you often haven't had paradigmatic debate. I think the last time there was a major paradigmatic debate was probably right after 9/11, and before that, just after the Soviet Union's collapse. So we've had approximately one big paradigmatic debate, which doesn't last very long, every 10 to 15 years for the past, what, 25
Right.
years. Often, I think in every case, the assumptions that have won out until now have been assumptions that were inherited from the Cold War. We're in a very different world now. I mean, 2016 is just an enormously different world. And so I expect this to be, a more fearsome debate in which, we don't understand what side is winning through much of the administration, where some of it will look a lot like Obama or like Bush, and then suddenly it won't. And it'll be clear that in other ways we're in completely new territory. It also obviously comes as we're seeing this massive populist wave sweeping through multiple countries, both through European states. We can see populism coming to the Philippines, to South Korea, and elsewhere. The entire world order is shifting in important ways, and who knows who's going to win out? But that's going to make this a much more fearsome debate, and one where I think a lot of ideas that have seemed off the table are suddenly going to be, back on the table and at play.
Right. Well, I want to get back to the point you said about this debate, because I think that's kind of the core of our discussion today. I wrote a piece for The Nation back in March about Trump's foreign policy, and noting, and one of the things I said in there was, Trump. In my view, it seemed clear that even though Trump was opposed by most of the neoconservative camp, it seemed pretty clear to me that he was capitalizing on a kind of nationalist bluster that they've really developed and perfected over many years. Except he just kind of had the bluster. There was very little policy to it. Although I do think there is a foreign policy thinking going on, but. And I quoted you in that piece, and you had some really interesting comments, and I think you just echoed them just now, where, we've had, the last time we had one of these big debates was post 9/11, and in the wake of the Iraq War, and the kind of fissures that created in what I might call conservative foreign policy thinking, but let's just say in foreign policy thinking in general, that much needed rethinking and that much needed debate had been forestalled by a number of things. But here we are now, and we, like it or not, we are in the midst of this, and we're going to have this debate because, Donald Trump clearly is breaking something new and different. And one other point I want to make, you said, you talked about some of the assumptions we brought from the Cold War post 9/11. I think that's really important because, one of the things I think that did lead to Iraq was this conception that was carried over from the Cold War was that these terrorist groups have to be state-sponsored, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people in the administration and out in deciding that Saddam Hussein needed to be the target was just this strong assumption based on relatively little evidence that there was this strong Saddam Al-Qaeda connection, and that Al-Qaeda needed to be understood as having state sponsorship in some aspect. And so it'll be interesting to see and to watch out for what assumptions from the past 10 to 15 years people might be trying to carry over into the future debates that might not be valid.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the Cold War assumption of that terrorism of this magnitude had to be state-sponsored. Very interestingly, in the time that I've looked over all the relevant documents, I hadn't thought of that quite as much as being a Cold War assumption, but it obviously is. That is, in fact, where it came from. So I agree with you that it's, and I agree with what I'd said previously to you about this being first and foremost, a crisis of conservative foreign policy. I think we have a broader crisis of foreign policy writ large. Mm-hmm. But within conservative foreign policy, I remember when I first came into the public sphere, it was I think 2014. And so at that point, I remember there was always pressure on me from some of my conservative friends to be for the Iraq War. I've opposed it as long as I've been in the public sphere. And the justification was given, well, you're going to interact with a lot of people who are pro-Iraq war, so you'll get along with them much better if you say you're for it.
2004, not 2014, right?
2004, yeah. 2004, it's been a dozen years here. And, that's something I never bid on. To me, one thing I'm happy about with my career is there's just been it's not as though I've gotten everything right. None of us have. But there's been nothing I've had to really walk back. And one of the interesting things about the Iraq War, which I think is such a self-evident mistake, is it's almost as though kind of it never happened. I mean, when you got to 2008, McCain had been a huge proponent, and there was no explaining away the Bush legacy of foreign policy. He tried to run against both Bush and Obama, but that was a hard tightrope to walk. It really wasn't until 2016 that kind of Trump came in and basically brushed that entire foreign policy establishment aside during the course of the primaries, and brushed a lot of assumptions aside in the process. And now with him in the White House, there's a whole lot of assumptions that are going to be challenged and up for dispute. And I mean, one thing which I think actually is worth mentioning, because this is something that you mentioned on Facebook, and look, there's also the assumptions about what is acceptable in terms of public discourse. I mean, I think that really 2016 was a breaking point in terms of mass media being able to mediate the terms of what is acceptable. Now that won't. The power of mass media may come back, but fundamentally, it was the year that social media kind of overtook mass media, and it would have been unthinkable before that a presidential candidate, in the primary would make fun of McCain for being a prisoner of war, would talk about a ban on an entire religious group, would be seen as referring to people from one country as rapists. Like, all of these are things that would have been unthinkable, that would just torpedo a candidacy. Everyone remembers, of course, when Howard Dean said, what was it? Yow! Wasn't it yow? Yeah. And then his candidacy was done. And that was very much a sunken candidacy in the age of mass media. Nassim Nicholas Taleb on Twitter at one point referred to Trump's campaign as anti-fragile, meaning that chaos benefits rather than harms it. And I think that some people made fun of that at the time, but that I think it was essentially right. That it's an anti-fragile campaign. It was one where, by not backing down, not apologizing, changing his mind every 10 minutes, but never walking things back, he was able to do something unique.
Unique, yes.
Well, and obviously the laughter there is because part of what this puts into question, when you sweep out old orders, you sweep out some things that deserve to be swept away, and some things that really deserve to stay. And I think one of the key questions, and obviously we're talking about foreign policy, and this does relate to it, is whose rights are negotiable. I think one of the assumptions a lot of people had coming in is that if religious groups or ethnic groups were singled out during the course of a campaign, other Americans would see that as unacceptable. And what justifiably concerns so many people is that their rights as citizens are now seen as more negotiable, not fully negotiable by any means, but more negotiable than they were seen in 2015.
Right. Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. So, looking at, this debate that Trump has now started, what do you see the impact? It's obviously hard to predict. We're not, his presidency hasn't even started, but it seems to me that he is, just looking at Flynn, looking at McFarland, looking at the relationship we know that Trump's campaign has had with people like Frank Gaffney, some of these very, I will just call them, anti-Muslim, some of the stuff that they've been, there's the video of Michael Flynn speaking at an Act for America event. Act for America is one of these just overtly anti-Muslim conspiracy groups. I don't think there's any other word. And repeating some of these really, and for me, as someone who's done a lot of research into some of these groups and some of the ideas that they push, this idea coming out of Flynn's mouth that, I'm trying to get this quote right, where he said, "I don't see Islam as a religion, I see it as a political ideology." The alarm bells that sets off in my mind, and I think a lot of people's minds, are very loud. And it seems that this is trending toward, an embrace of essentially this.
Go ahead. I want you to continue, but let me actually just jump in with a short intervention, which is I would not at all put KT McFarland in that camp. I think I've known KT McFarland for quite some time. I don't think that represents her views. She certainly is a conservative foreign policy figure. But I think I would separate out what Flynn said and some of the other figures you're mentioning from McFarland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's fair. But Flynn being the main, the national security advisor, and also I would mention Steve Bannon, under whose leadership, and even before that, while Andrew Bright was still around, Breitbart had completely embraced this kind of vision, the creeping Sharia, civilization jihad kind of conception of the quote unquote Muslim peril. And it's given that both of these people, Flynn and Bannon, have positions of real influence, possibly the two most important positions of influence over national security, it could be really bad, I think, if America embraces this kind of war of civilizations framing. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think a war of civilizations framing is not going to be helpful. One thing you and I discussed this issue in a very different context in our first blogging heads together, which was in January 2011. And I remember back in that initial blogging heads, I told this story. I probably didn't tell it very well because it's not actually a very interesting story. But it was an experience I had talking to a State Department officer in a conference I was at in Germany. And we were talking about the debate. She was talking about the debate over the Ground Zero mosque. So at one point, I was, my own views on the Ground Zero mosque debate were somewhat complex, but I didn't think it was a very well argued debate. But at one point, it turned to the subject of kind of apostasy laws within Islam, which I said I thought were a problem. And she kind of got so angry that I would raise that she kind of ended the discussion and walked away in the middle. I think that, and so the point that I think I made then, like almost 6 years ago when we first did blogging heads together, is that for something, religions are complex things, and I guess subsequent to that, I wrote a dissertation looking at religion. And one of the books I read was by R. Scott Appleby. It's called The Ambivalence of the Sacred. And he makes a point that religion is often viewed in one of two ways. And one of them is that everything from religion is bad, but we'll cast that one aside because it's, other than kind of new atheists, it's not very popular in the public sphere. Bill Maher is probably the most well-known proponent, and then you have some others across the pond in Europe who make that argument. But the way we tend to view it as Americans is that everything from religion is good, and it robs religion of its complexity. I think that this is a debate where I think that the way that we think about the Islamic faith is going to be very different in 10 to 15 years, and a lot on both the left and the right will seem somewhat antiquated. There's debates within Islam that for the past 8 years we've kind of pushed to the side. In places, in lots of Middle Eastern states, even in Saudi Arabia, you have this debate kind of at the margins, but becoming more loud about atheism. There's Saudis for the first time signing their name to a document saying that they renounce religion. Subsequent to our last blogging heads, you had the Arab Spring revolutions. And this really changed the way that Islamism was viewed. I mean, prior to 2011, within much of the European left, Islamism was just viewed as kind of a counter-imperialist, counter-authoritarian movement. Then suddenly, in places like Tunisia and Egypt, you had Islamist parties winning at the ballot box, and secularists who shared values with the European left feeling very, very threatened. So the way that we refer to Muslim-majority countries, and have for some time, is, in my view, at some point going to look every bit as antiquated as the way we referred to the Western world in the early 20th century. Right, back then, as you know, of course, it was referred to as the Christian world. If someone uses that terminology today, they'd probably be ridden out of town as a bigot. But that's how we thought of the Western world. But yet we still call the Muslim majority states the Muslim world, as though it's monolithic and as though other forms of religious practice don't particularly matter.
Right.
Now, this is a very long-winded answer, but getting back to what you were actually asking, it's what I'm guilty of all the time. But getting back to what you were actually asking about, I mean, at a foreign policy level, clash of civilizations is not helpful to us as a country. Like, this is not a clash of civilizations, but it's also, religion means different things in different part of the world. Religion is much more ambiguous than most people think, and I do think that Obama's rhetoric often captures that. But a lot of the assumptions that we've had under both the Bush and Obama administrations has been, has tended to view religion in the Middle East through a lens as though the natural state of religion is kind of 20th to 21st century American Protestantism, I think that getting more complexity. I think that this debate may be good, but that having if America takes a turn where it embraces a clash of civilization views, that is going to be profoundly unhelpful. My own view is that we probably aren't going to take that turn for a variety of reasons based upon my reading of tea leaves as to where influence is going to lie. And certainly, look, I mean, this is an administration where I do have a lot of connections, and certainly I'm going to put a lot of effort into battling the ideas which I think would be destructive against for us as a nation to embrace.
Well, good. Glad to hear it. I'm also glad to hear, so you don't think some of the things we've heard from Flynn and others, do you think these things will butt up against just reality, the national interest, the bureaucracy, or a combination of all of the above?
That's a good question. Part of it is based upon my view of, look, for everyone within the administration, you're going to have multiple people who have their ear. So part of this is just based upon my reading of who's likely to have various individuals' ears. I don't want to kind of go much further without getting too inside baseball. And look, let me say outright, I could well be wrong. And what you're articulating, a clash of civilizations type view, is a real risk, 100% a real risk.
Yeah.
Like my view is that perspective is not going to end up winning out and driving U.S. policy. I think the understanding of Islam as a faith and the Islamic world. Ironically, I use that term since I just critiqued using it, but I think that understanding of those will be different. Again, there will be something that's up for debate. I think the area where it would become most dangerous is when if you put people's, as I was saying before, if people's rights as citizens or as visitors are seen as negotiable. I think that is very dangerous. And to me, it's not so much, for kind of moralistic reasons, though I believe that there firmly are moral reasons. But I think our country works better when constant with the assumptions that we have as a constitutional republic and that the Western liberal order has embraced, when people are accepted as citizens regardless of their identity. Citizenship is something which is instilled. I mean, there certainly are things which I think we're right to accept of citizens, and another debate that obviously exists is over Europe and the migrant crisis, and I do think that there are dangers to sudden demographic shifts when people don't necessarily come from places where such liberal orders are accepted. That can create deep problems. In Europe right now, a lot of European populism is driven by that fact, as well as driven by concerns about security, concerns about criminality, economy, things like that. But ultimately, it's my belief that we won't in this administration see people's rights as citizens being negotiated, but just the fact that the negotiability has kind of came up during the campaign, and to some extent will be considered I think that opens a lot of doors, which probably not in the next 4 years, but at some point in the future, I think that if not the next 4 years, there's a lot of dangers there. It's opened a Pandora's box that we haven't seen opened in quite some time.
Right. Well, we have in the time we have left. I know we had a couple other items. I mean, we wanted to touch on Trump's Syria approach, but maybe we can kind of combine that with some, what you and I were talking about before we started. This was just, what you feel, what we feel needs to be kind of a skepticism toward what Trump might propose, but how that's not just true for Trump, but true of, the analytical community all the time, or should be, right?
Yeah. I mean,
kick it off.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I am intensely interested in is, where do people make intellectual errors? Why do smart people get things badly wrong and then not adjust after they do so? And the thing that made me most intensely interested in this was the massive misreading by many within my field of what the Arab uprisings were going to mean. But I've seen a number of other kind of areas where you've had these errors that puzzled me. The competition between ISIS and Al-Qaeda was another one where, 2 years ago, people were saying that ISIS was going to just eat up the Al-Qaeda network. I argued against that, and that hasn't happened. But both times I was basically, yelling into a tornado. I think that there's a lot of reasons why analytical errors take place. I'm not going to diagnose all of them, but what I do want to say is, I think to some extent, under the Obama administration, I think that experts in my field were insufficiently skeptical of the administration overall. And by that I mean, I don't mean kind of the marginal figures who may be demarginalized under Trump, but figures who would be defined as thought leaders within the field. And I think anytime one gets kind of I think it's good to be an insider, in that it's much better to be able to kind of argue with the lever of power rather than yelling from the outside. But anytime being an insider trumps one's values or kind of overrides, where careerism overrides one's sense of obligation, that's where errors end up getting made. And so now
I guess what you're talking about, just to kind of quick, I mean, talking about when that access comes at the cost of your kind of, candor.
Yeah.
Right.
Precisely. And I think one always needs to maintain candor. I think there's I think we do have an obligation as whether it's public intellectuals or foreign policy intellectuals or however one would define what it is we do. I think there is an obligation for candor. So I think that one should be skeptical regardless of who's in power. And I think often any administration. I mean, I think this has been true this will be true of Trump as it has been of the last two administrations. Any administration tends to see its critics as enemies. I know Obama, towards the beginning of his presidency, tried to take a different approach when he had that dinner with conservative pundits. But I think viewed correctly, and again, we have a very coarse public discourse, so I think it's hard to fully take this view. But a lot of times, it's your critics who are actually, perhaps some of your best friends in some instances. If someone's warning you of catastrophe that's coming, and you don't heed them, then it probably would have been better if you had given them a little bit more of your ear. I think that when someone tells you too much of what you want to hear, then there also is reason to be skeptical and question whether they're actually giving you everything that you deserve.
Right. No, but I think that's right, and I think the point you make about access and candor is obviously true. It's true across all policy areas, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the question. I think all analysts, policy professionals, whomever, have to constantly ask. I mean, yes, it's great to be able to go to those meetings and talk to people who actually make the decisions, but am I censoring myself for fear of not getting invited back?
Yeah. Yeah. And
and go ahead.
No, I mean, and look, and I think that the natural tendency under a lot of administrations is for that to happen. That's one thing which I believe I've always been able to avoid is is lack of candor for sake of preserving access. I think that candor is what anybody deserves from us at the end of the day.
Right. Agreed. Let's, I hate to say let's do Syria in 5 minutes, but if we could just touch on, as a specific, I think we've talked in some general terms about what Trump might bring here, but let's just zero in for some specifics. Like, I think, as you said earlier, Trump has signaled that he wants to go harder on specifically on the question, of fighting ISIS.
Yeah.
And so, what do you think that means for Syria and Iraq, which I think in some ways need to be understood, as what kind of one policy? You might disagree, but clearly they're related. So, what do you expect to see?
Well, it's hard to see in terms of fighting ISIS what that's going to mean. I mean, ISIS is in a state of utter collapse. It might mean doing more to try to mop up the finished pieces of ISIS, and there might be some benefit or some harm to doing so. But ultimately, to me, the big problem with Iraq, Syria isn't the extent to which we go after them hard. It's that you have just to hone in on the Iraq problem set, and then we'll talk about Syria in a second. It's that you have this ripe ground for another Sunni uprising, based on the fact that the same grievances that helped to give rise to the uprising that produced ISIS, still exist. You still have a lot of Sunni disenfranchisement, and it's in some extent it's being exacerbated by things like the Hashid al-Shabi, the popular mobilization forces that are backed by Iran and that have been cleansing areas of Sunni citizens. Now, in terms of Syria, I think the big difference is not going to be in ISIS, with respect to ISIS, so much as Assad. And this is, as we talked about before, this is an area where, while imperfect, at least from what we can tell right now, I see the Trump foreign policy as being preferable to either the Obama or the Clinton foreign policy. And bear in mind, a lot of people would disagree with me, and there are very reasonable disagreements. Syria is an area where there's very few good options. But the Obama foreign policy was a complex one, which had us funding both sides of the civil war. The Kurdish YPG was pro-Assad. He was also financing and arming the anti-Assad rebels. Now, the reason why they were financing both wasn't explicitly to help both sides in a civil war. It's because there were two conflicts in the country. There was the Assad conflict set and then the ISIS conflict set. But in practice, you ended up with the YPG at some points fighting against Sunni rebels who we were also backing. The Sunni rebels who we backed helped al-Qaeda to make advances. As Michael Weiss, a journalist who has a much more hawkish view on Syria than I do, at one point said, he and I were testifying before Congress around the same time, and he said that the U.S. foreign policy looks much more like the conspiracy theories than one should be comfortable with. And I think that's absolutely correct. Hillary Clinton would have had much more of a humanitarian-based policy. And look, again, looking at the pictures, one understands why. But something like a no-fly zone, which she advocated in the debate, would be much more costly and involve much more danger of a great power conflict with Russia than I'm comfortable with. On the other hand, Trump, in prioritizing the fight against jihadism, is basically going to give the country over to Syria, to Assad, and to Putin. That is not an ideal set of policies. There's a lot of problems with that. But overall, I think that the dangers of a no-fly zone were a greater concern to me. Again, plenty will disagree, but that's an area where I see the Trump foreign policy as being at least somewhat more coherent with respect to our national interest.
Do you think that the ISIS problem you can deal with it? Not only ISIS, but some of these other groups with Assad still in power. I mean, aren't we talking about just kind of like taking our hands off and letting him, the Russians and Assads and the Iranians together completely just crush the opposition?
I don't know what it means, right? I mean, that's why my view is a bit tempered, and I stress the not ideal part of it. So, I mean, the one thing that it could mean, what it's been so far is kind of is protecting the rump state. of Assad. And the Assad-Rump state. I think all things considered, I'm more comfortable with the Assad's Rump state not collapsing. Part of the reason being that I think if it did, the religious minorities that he's protecting would be subjected to absolute slaughter. But that being said, I mean, he's slaughtering people every day, right? Like, there's no bloodless course forward. Like for the other groups, you're with Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, which is an Al Qaeda affiliate, which pretends it's not these days. It's very embedded within all the rebel forces. That creates, and I apologize for the coughing. I think my vocal cords are giving out at the very end, but I'll try to salvage them for at least having a powerful statement.
Just finish this point.
Yeah, yeah, but as we know, it takes me like 15 minutes to finish a point. That's why. So to finish this point very quickly, the jihadists are so embedded with a lot of the Syrian rebels. That's one of the reasons that the Obama foreign policy has looked so incoherent, because it is actually legitimately difficult to have a policy of helping rebels without helping jihadists at the same time. As to what Trump's going to do, I don't think his team, my guess is that his team doesn't know, right? It's not like they've been in power and looking at the intelligence reports, nor do they know what the Russians want if the Russians are given free hand. But I think they have at least a direction that foreign policy is going to take in Syria.
Yeah. All right, David, this was great. Really enjoyed it. Let's do it again soon. Let's check in, in a couple months when we've got, I think, some more specifics in terms of his appointments and his direction. Any last thoughts before we check out?
No, Matt. It was great talking to you, and I think for the viewers, especially those who are part of specialist communities, I would just emphasize the way in which things are now open for debate that we didn't think were open for debate before. Understanding that, I think, opens up this interesting area in which principles are going to be revisited as they have been in 15 to 25 years. And as scary as that is, it's also exciting.
Right. All right. Well, thanks, David. Let's do it again soon. Have a great day.
You too, Matt.